The spring of 1945 did not feel like a victory for everyone. For millions, it felt like the end of the world. As the Allied iron ring tightened around the crumbling heart of the Third Reich, the geography of terror began to shift. For years, the concentration camps had operated as isolated islands of industrialized murder, hidden behind electrified fences and the silence of the surrounding German population. But as the sound of Soviet artillery rumbled from the east and American tank treads clattered from the west, the walls of the universe of the camps began to crack. The SS guards, once the undisputed masters of life and death, suddenly found themselves staring into a future where their black uniforms were no longer symbols of power, but targets for vengeance. By mid-April, the atmosphere inside the camps reached a fever pitch of paranoia and desperation. The SS leadership, following chaotic and often contradictory orders from Berlin, scrambled to erase the evidence of their crimes. This led to the infamous death marches, where thousands of emaciated prisoners were driven into the German interior. However, in camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, thousands of inmates remained, too weak to move, trapped in a limbo between liberation and a final, desperate massacre. The guards were no longer the arrogant Aryans of propaganda. They were panicked men, some choosing to flee into the woods, others changing into civilian rags, and a few, the fanatics, deciding to stay and fight to the bitter end, determined to take as many enemies of the state with them as possible. When the first Allied scouts approached the gates of these camps, they were not prepared for what they saw. Even the most battle-hardened veterans, men who had seen the carnage of Normandy and the Hurtgen forest, were paralyzed by the sight. The air was thick with the sweet, cloying stench of death, a smell that would haunt the liberators for the rest of their lives. They found piles of bodies stacked like cordwood and living skeletons who crawled toward them, weeping and clawing at their uniforms. In this moment of profound shock, the American and British soldiers underwent a radical psychological transformation. The rules of war and the Geneva Convention, which they had been trained to uphold, suddenly felt inadequate, even offensive, in the face of such absolute evil. Inside the barracks, the prisoners watched the liberation through a haze of typhus and starvation. For years, their world had been defined by the whip, the dog, and the gas chamber. They had seen their friends and families turned into smoke. Now, as the SS towers fell and the gates were smashed open, a primal, dormant emotion began to stir in their hollow chests. The thirst for reckoning. It wasn't about the law. It wasn't about a courtroom in Nuremberg. It was about the man who had kicked them yesterday. It was about the guard who had shot their brother for a piece of bread. The liberation was not just the end of their imprisonment. It was the beginning of an era of uncontrolled retribution. The guards who were captured in these first hours faced a terrifying reality. Many tried to surrender, raising their hands in the traditional gesture of a defeated soldier. But to the American GIs who had just walked through the crematoriums, these were not soldiers. They were monsters. The military discipline that usually governed the Allied troops began to dissolve. In some sectors, officers looked the other way. In others, they actively handed their sidearms to the former inmates. The day of reckoning had arrived, and it would be written in blood. The transition from the systematic terror of the SS to the chaotic, explosive rage of the liberated was instantaneous. As we look at the events of late April 1945, we must understand the moral vacuum that existed. The German state had vanished. The Allied military government was not yet established. In this vacuum, the only law that mattered was the law of the jungle. An eye for an eye, A life for a life. The guards, who had spent years dehumanizing their victims, were now being dehumanized in return. They were hunted through the woods, pulled from hiding spots in barns, and dragged back to the very fences they once patrolled. The stage was set for some of the most controversial and violent hours in the history of the Second World War, where the line between the victim and the executioner became dangerously thin. On April 29, 1945, the soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army approached the gates of Dachau, the first and longest-running concentration camp of the Nazi regime. For these young Americans, the war was supposed to be reaching its conclusion, a journey toward peace. But as they neared the camp's perimeter, they stumbled upon the death train. 39 railway cars filled with thousands of emaciated corpses, people who had starved or suffocated just days before the arrival of help. This sight acted as a psychological trigger. The shock turned into a cold, radiating fury. When the soldiers finally entered the camp and saw the survivors, ghost-like figures covered in filth and sores, the standard operating procedures for taking prisoners of war were effectively discarded. The SS guards at Dachau had made a fatal miscalculation. While the higher-ranking officers had fled days earlier, several hundred guards remained behind, some of them recent recruits and others veteran Totenkopf, Death's Head members. They expected to surrender and be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Instead, they walked into a whirlwind of vengeance. As the American GIs moved through the camp, they began to round up every man in a black or field gray uniform. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Soldiers who had spent months fighting a visible enemy on the battlefield were now face to face with the architects of a silent industrial slaughter. The Dachau liberation punishment began almost immediately. In several areas of the camp, small groups of SS guards were lined up against walls. Eyewitness accounts suggest that the American soldiers didn't even wait for orders. In the coal yard and near the hospital, the sound of M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns echoed through the camp. Dozens of SS men were mown down in bursts of gunfire. To the soldiers pulling the triggers, this wasn't murder. It was an execution of monsters. General Felix Sparks later recalled the difficulty of maintaining order as his men, overcome by the stench of the crematoriums, began to view the guards not as humans, but as vermin that needed to be eradicated on the spot. But the Americans were not the only ones seeking blood. Once the fences were breached, the survivors who still had the strength to stand took matters into their own hands. Encouraged by the sight of their liberators' rage, groups of former inmates began to hunt down the guards who had gone into hiding. They used anything they could find: shovels, pieces of iron, and even their bare hands. Guards were pulled from guard towers and beaten to death in the very courtyards where they had once presided over roll calls. In one of the most chilling accounts, inmates were given handguns and bayonets by sympathetic soldiers to settle years of systemic torture in a matter of minutes. By midday, the hospital wall at Dachau had become a site of mass execution. While the exact number of SS guards killed remains a subject of historical debate, it is clear that several hundred met their end that day without a trial. The American High Command would later attempt to investigate these incidents as war crimes committed by their own troops. But the sheer emotional weight of the Holocaust made such prosecutions nearly impossible. How could a military prosecutor convict a soldier for killing a guard found standing over a pile of murdered children? The moral compass of the world had been shattered by the revelations of Dachau, and the day of the gun was the result. The violence was not just physical. It was a total collapse of the hierarchy of power. For 12 years, the SS had used fear to maintain absolute control. In the span of a few hours, that fear was returned to them 1,000-fold. The guards who survived the initial wave of executions were forced by the Americans to handle the thousands of rotting corpses found in the camp. They were made to see, touch, and carry the evidence of their crimes, often under the bayonets of soldiers who were looking for any excuse to pull the trigger. This was the first true moment of denazification, not through textbooks or laws, but through the raw, brutal confrontation with the reality of the camps. As the sun began to set over Dachau on April 29th, the camp was a scene of surreal carnage. The liberators had become executioners, and the victims had become hunters. The neat lines of military discipline had been blurred by a collective trauma that the world was only beginning to process. The events at Dachau served as a grim blueprint for what would happen in other camps across Germany. The message was clear. For the SS, there would be no quiet surrender. The gates of the camps had opened, and the spirits of the dead were demanding their pound of flesh. While Dachau was a scene of sudden American fury, Buchenwald, located near the cultural heart of Weimar, presented a different kind of retribution. Unlike many other camps, Buchenwald had a highly organized underground resistance composed of political prisoners. As the Third Army under General Patton approached in mid-April 1945, the inmates didn't wait to be rescued. They sensed the vacuum of power. When the SS began to flee, the prisoners, who had spent months secretly assembling crude weapons and stealing grenades, launched an armed uprising. They stormed the watchtowers and seized the perimeter. For the SS guards who were too slow to escape, the situation turned into a nightmare of poetic justice. The liberation of Buchenwald was, in part, an act of self-redemption. Prisoners who had been treated like cattle for years now held the guns. When the American troops finally rolled through the gates, they found the camp already under the control of the inmates. But this control was fragile and fueled by years of suppressed rage. The captured guards were gathered in the central muster ground, the dreaded Appellplatz. Here, the roles were reversed. The prisoners interrogated their former tormentors, and for many guards, the interrogation was the last thing they experienced. The Americans, shocked by the sight of the camp's zoo, where the SS kept animals in better conditions than humans, and the skin-bound lampshades of Ilse Koch, largely stood back and let the inmates settle their scores. The violence in Buchenwald was more calculated than the spontaneous shootings in Dachau. It was a systematic cleansing. The inmate committees identified the most brutal Kapos and SS guards. These men were taken behind the barracks. The sounds of heavy thuds and muffled screams filled the nights following the liberation. It was a cold, methodical extraction of vengeance. The liberators reported seeing guards being forced to march through the camp while survivors spat on them and struck them with sticks. It was a public ritual of humiliation, designed to strip the SS of their perceived racial superiority before they were finally disposed of. Then there was Bergen-Belsen. If Dachau was about rage and Buchenwald about revolt, Belsen was about the horror of the silent death. When the British 11th Armored Division entered the camp on April 15th, they didn't find a battle. They found a graveyard. There was no food, no water, and thousands of bodies were rotting in the open air due to a typhus epidemic. The British soldiers, usually known for their stiff upper lip, were broken by the sight. The commander of the camp, Joseph Kramer, known as the Beast of Belsen, greeted the British with an arrogant smile, expecting to be treated as a fellow officer. The British response was a harbinger of the specialized punishment that awaited the Belsen guards. In Belsen, the British did not immediately execute the guards. Instead, they invented a more grueling form of justice. They forced the SS men and women, those gods of the camps, to bury the thousands of corpses with their bare hands. Under the barrels of British Bren guns, the SS guards were denied gloves or tools. They had to drag the typhus-ridden bodies of their victims into mass graves, day after day, until many of the guards themselves contracted the disease and died. The local German population was also forced to walk through the camp to witness the stench and the horror. This was a psychological war. The British wanted the SS to be literally consumed by the filth they had created. The Beast of Belsen and his female counterpart, Irma Grise, were kept in small cells, constantly heckled and humiliated by the very people they had tortured. The British soldiers' hatred was so intense that they often had to be rotated out to prevent them from simply gunning down the prisoners in cold blood. The moral weight of Belsen was so heavy that it changed British military policy overnight. The vengeance here was slow and agonizing. It was the spectacle of the SS being reduced to the same level of filth and disease as their victims. This period showed that liberation was a multifaceted process. In every camp, the dynamic of revenge shifted based on who arrived first: the Americans with their quick guns, the British with their forced labor, or the inmates with their years of stored-up hatred. But in all cases, the message to the world was being telegraphed. The era of the SS master was dead, and the era of the hunted had begun. The guards were no longer men. They were the physical embodiment of a nightmare that the world was trying to wake up from, and the only way to wake up was to destroy the nightmare's architects. As the front lines moved deeper into the heart of Germany, a new and chaotic phase of vengeance began. The SS guards who had managed to flee the camps before the Allies arrived were not simply running from an army. They were running from their own faces. In the final weeks of April 1945, the roads of Bavaria and Saxony were choked with a desperate mass of humanity. Refugees, retreating Wehrmacht soldiers, and the wolves in hiding. Thousands of SS men discarded their black tunics, burned their paybooks, and donned the tattered clothes of common soldiers or local farmers. They hoped that in the smoke and fire of a collapsing nation, they could disappear. But for the survivors and the specialized Allied units, the hunt had just begun. The hunt was fueled by a unique kind of intelligence: the memory of the victims. Groups of liberated prisoners, often still wearing their striped zebra uniforms, refused to stay in the camps. They formed small, unofficial hunting parties. They knew the faces of their tormentors better than they knew the faces of their own families. These bands of survivors roamed the nearby villages, searching barns, cellars, and forest shacks. When they found a man who looked too well-fed or whose posture was too military, they didn't call for a military policeman. They settled the matter on the spot. In the chaotic vacuum of post-war Germany, justice was often a quick trial in a farmyard followed by a short rope or a single bullet. American and British intelligence officers also developed a foolproof method for identifying the elite of the terror system. Every member of the SS was supposed to have his blood group tattooed on the underside of his left arm. During the mass surrenders, Allied soldiers would force thousands of German men to stand with their arms raised. Any man with the telltale A, B, or O tattooed near the armpit was immediately pulled from the line. These tattoos, once symbols of racial purity and pride, became death sentences or tickets to a high-security interrogation center. The fear among the SS was so great that many attempted to cut the tattoos out with knives or burn them with cigarettes, leaving behind raw, suspicious scars that only confirmed their guilt to the Allied hunters. One of the most intense hunts occurred in the forests surrounding the Flossenburg concentration camp. As the SS attempted to evacuate the prisoners toward the south, many guards broke away, hoping to reach the Alpine Redoubt, where they believed a final Nazi stand would be made. They didn't count on the local resistance and the vengeful spirit of the American 90th Infantry Division. For days, the woods were the scene of a terrifying game of cat and mouse. When guards were caught, they were often brought back to the roads where the death marches had taken place. They were forced to dig graves for the prisoners they had shot just hours before, and in many documented cases, they were executed and buried in the same trenches. This period also saw the rise of organized avengers. While many acts of revenge were spontaneous, some groups, like the Jewish Nachum, or specialized units within the Allied forces, began to track down specific high-ranking SS officers. They utilized captured Nazi records to build lists of names and addresses. These men weren't looking for a public trial in Nuremberg. They were looking for an eye for an eye. They operated in the shadows of the occupation, kidnapping former guards from their homes and leaving their bodies in the ruins of the cities they once ruled. The message was clear. No matter how deep you bury your uniform, the ghost of the camp will find you. The psychological toll on the German civilian population during this hunt was immense. For years, they had looked the other way as the trains rolled to the camps. Now they watched as the masters of the race were dragged through the streets in rags, beaten and humiliated. The myth of the invincible SS was shattered. The hunt forced the German people to see the men they had admired as the criminals they were. The stripping of the uniform was not just a physical act. It was the total deconstruction of the Nazi identity. A man who had once held the power of a god over thousands was now a shivering fugitive, terrified of a man in a striped uniform who remembered his face. As April turned to May, the hunt moved from the battlefields to the displaced persons camps and the ruins of Berlin. The SS had spent years perfecting the art of the hunt, hunting Jews, partisans, and deviants. Now the hunters had become the most hunted men in human history. Every knock on a door, every Allied checkpoint, and every glance from a former prisoner became a source of agonizing paranoia. The era of the Black Order ended not with a glorious last stand, but with thousands of men cowering in the shadows, waiting for a retribution that they knew deep down they had earned. In the traditional mindset of the 1940s, women were often viewed as figures of compassion, or at least as non-combatants. However, the liberation of the camps shattered this illusion forever. As Allied soldiers entered places like Bergen-Belsen and Ravensbrück, they encountered the SS Aufseherinnen, the female overseers. These women, such as the notorious Irma Grese, known as the Hyena of Auschwitz, and Maria Mandl, had proven themselves to be just as sadistic and sometimes more inventive in their cruelty than their male counterparts. When the gates fell, the fury directed at these women was unique, fueled by a mixture of horror at their crimes and a profound sense of betrayal of their perceived feminine nature. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen by British forces provided the world with its first clear look at the female face of the SS. When the British soldiers arrived, they found the female guards still in the camp, seemingly convinced that their gender would protect them from the consequences of their actions. They were wrong. The British troops, usually disciplined, found it impossible to remain indifferent when they saw women standing arrogantly next to piles of dead children. The Aufseherinnen were immediately rounded up and subjected to the same brutal labor as the men. They were forced to handle the decaying bodies of typhus victims, dragging them to mass graves while being mocked and cursed by the survivors who had once cowered at the sound of their boots. For the female prisoners, the revenge against the Zikas, as they sometimes called the guards, was deeply personal. For years, these guards had used humiliation as a weapon, shaving women's heads, subjecting them to freezing inspections, and tearing children from their arms. Once liberated, the former inmates turned the tables. In several documented incidents, groups of women survivors surrounded their former tormentors, stripping them of their pristine uniforms and cutting their hair in a ritual of public shaming. The physical beauty that some of these guards, like Irma Gries, had prided themselves on while their victims wasted away, became a target for rage. In the chaotic days following the surrender, the Allied military police struggled to protect female SS prisoners from the people's justice. In the villages surrounding the camps, local civilians who had lived in fear of being labeled traitors joined the survivors in hunting down the Aufseherinnen who had tried to hide in civilian clothes. Unlike the male SS, who could sometimes blend into the retreating Wehrmacht, the female guards were easier to spot due to their distinctive mannerisms and the specific locations of their service. When caught, they were often paraded through the streets, forced to endure the same public appel, roll call, they had forced upon others, often standing for hours in the mud under the sun. The British and American legal systems also struggled with how to handle these women. While some were eventually brought to trial in the Belsen or Auschwitz trials, many met their end in the wild justice of the liberation. There are accounts of female guards being handed over to the vengeful crowds by soldiers who simply walked away, unable to bear the thought of defending such individuals. The psychological shock of seeing a woman participate in industrial-scale murder led to a complete suspension of the era's usual chivalry. In the eyes of the liberators and the survivors, these were not women. They were SS beasts who had forfeited their right to any special consideration. One of the most chilling aspects of this chapter of history was the defiance of these women. Many of the Aufseherinnen, even as they were being dragged to the mass graves to work, showed no remorse. This lack of humanity only fanned the flames of hatred. In the barracks where they were held, the guards were often forced to listen to the stories of the survivors, face to face, for the first time without the protection of a whip or a pistol. This confrontation was a form of psychological execution before the physical one. The myth that women were merely helpers in the Nazi machine was buried in the mass graves of 1945, right alongside the guards who had helped fill them. The fate of the female guards was a stark reminder that in the final reckoning of the Third Reich, the law of retribution knew no gender. The black and silver insignias of the SS had become a mark of Cain. As the hunt for the Aufseherinnen continued throughout the summer of 1945, the world began to realize that the infection of Nazi ideology had reached every level of society. The vengeance taken upon these women was a brutal reflection of the total moral collapse of the world they had helped to create. A world where even the traditional roles of mother and protector had been twisted into those of the executioner. As the smoke began to clear over the liberated camps in May 1945, a new conflict emerged: the struggle between the rule of law and the rule of revenge. The Allied High Command was in a difficult position. On one hand, they were representatives of democratic nations that prided themselves on the right to a fair trial. On the other hand, the men on the ground, the captains, sergeants, and privates, had seen things that made the very idea of a fair trial for an SS guard seem like an insult to the dead. This tension led to a period of wild tribunals, where the line between legal execution and street justice was practically non-existent. In the first weeks after the German surrender, many Allied officers operated under an unwritten code. While officially they were supposed to arrest SS personnel and hand them over to the military police, in reality, many battlefield commissions were held in the woods or behind camp barracks. These were not courts of law. They were brief, grim confrontations. A guard would be identified by a survivor, his service record or his tattoos would be checked, and a sentence would be carried out within minutes. The American and British leadership often looked the other way, understanding that the emotional trauma of their troops was too great to control. They knew that if they forced their soldiers to protect the SS, they risked a mutiny of the soul. However, as the occupation became more organized, the Allied leadership realized that uncontrolled vengeance could destabilize the entire region. They began to establish provisional courts, but even these were far from the polished proceedings later seen at Nuremberg. In these early trials, the evidence was often the physical state of the survivors and the piles of corpses still being cleared. The defense for the SS was almost always the same. I was only following orders. In the spring of 1945, this excuse was met with stony silence or open derision. The atmosphere in these makeshift courtrooms was thick with hatred. The judges were men who had liberated the camps, and the witnesses were men who had been starved by the defendants. One of the most controversial aspects of this period was the role of the displaced persons, DPS. Millions of former slave laborers and camp survivors were now free, but they were trapped in a broken country. For many of them, the only way to process their grief was through active justice. Small, mobile groups of DPs would set up their own checkpoints on back roads, intercepting fleeing Germans. If they found a man with the SS mark, they would conduct a people's court. These events were brutal and swift. The Allied authorities, stretched thin and overwhelmed by the scale of the humanitarian crisis, often turned a blind eye to these unofficial executions, viewing them as an inevitable, if tragic, byproduct of the Nazi collapse. In the British zone of occupation, the approach was slightly more methodical, but no less stern. They began to organize the first Belsen trials as early as possible to show the world that justice could be served. Yet, even here, the public's thirst for blood was palpable. Outside the courtrooms, crowds of survivors and local Germans, some seeking redemption, others fueled by rage, would gather, demanding the maximum penalty. The wild tribunals served a psychological purpose that the official trials could not. They provided immediate, visceral closure. For a survivor who had lost everyone, a 6-month trial in a distant city meant nothing. Seeing his tormentor face a firing squad in the camp courtyard meant everything. The moral complexity of this era cannot be overstated. Allied soldiers found themselves in a twilight zone of ethics. They were told to be liberators, but they felt like avengers. Commanders like General Patton famously showed little sympathy for the captured SS, and this attitude trickled down to the lowest ranks. The wild justice of 1945 was a reflection of a world that had lost its moral compass because the crimes it was addressing were outside the scope of human imagination. There were no laws for the Holocaust, so the soldiers and survivors made their own. By the end of the summer, the wild tribunals began to fade as the formal Nuremberg process took over. But the shadow of those early, chaotic executions remained. Thousands of SS guards vanished into unmarked graves during those months, victims of a rage that the law could not contain. This was the dark spring of 1945, a time when the scales of justice were balanced not with gavels, but with bayonets and grief. The transition back to civilized law was slow and painful, as the world had to learn how to be human again in the wake of such absolute inhumanity. By the autumn of 1945, the fires of immediate revenge had largely burnt out, replaced by the cold, bureaucratic machinery of international law. The wild justice that had dominated the spring was superseded by the Nuremberg trials and the subsequent specialized trials for camp personnel. But as the world moved toward a formal accounting of Nazi crimes, a bitter truth began to emerge. While thousands of SS guards had been executed or beaten to death in the chaos of liberation, thousands more had successfully slipped through the cracks. The Ratlines, escape routes organized by sympathizers and even some members of the clergy, allowed many of the most brutal killers to find refuge in South America or the Middle East. This unevenness of justice created a lasting moral scar. For the survivors, the sight of former guards living quiet, middle-class lives in Argentina, or even returning to civilian jobs in Germany, was a second trauma. The vengeance of 1945 had been intense, but it was also haphazard. It often caught the small fish, the guards who were too slow or too low-ranking to have escape plans, while the masterminds of the camps sometimes managed to disappear into the fog of the Cold War. This realization led to the rise of professional Nazi hunters, men like Simon Wiesenthal, who understood that if the world would not provide justice, then they would have to hunt for it for decades to come. Looking back at those chaotic months of liberation, historians and ethicists still struggle with the moral consequences of the revenge taken. Was the execution of SS guards at Dachau a war crime? Or was it a necessary act of hygiene for a traumatized world? When we analyze the events of 1945, we see a world where the standard definitions of right and wrong had been incinerated in the ovens of the camps. The Allied soldiers and the survivors who took up arms were not acting out of a desire to be evil. They were reacting to an evil so profound that it shattered their belief in the slow process of the law. The revenge was a primal scream for balance in a universe that had gone horribly wrong. The legacy of this retribution also shaped the modern understanding of human rights and military conduct. The Dachau massacre investigations, though they led to no convictions, forced military leaders to realize that troops must be psychologically prepared for the horrors of war to prevent them from becoming the very monsters they fight. For the survivors, the acts of revenge were often the only thing that allowed them to reclaim their humanity. By striking back at their masters, they proved to themselves that the SS was not a master race, but merely men who could bleed, fear, and die. As the years turned into decades, the stories of the revenge after liberation were often buried in favor of a cleaner, more heroic narrative of the war. But the reality remains. The fall of the Third Reich was not just a military victory. It was a visceral, bloody, and often lawless reckoning. It was a time when the victims refused to be victims any longer, and the executioners finally had to face the eyes of those they had tormented. The blood spilled in the courtyards of Dachau and the woods of Buchenwald was the final payment for a debt of terror that had been building for 12 long years. Today, when we visit the silent memorials of the former camps, we must remember that they were once scenes of explosive violence, not just the violence of the Nazis, but the violence of a world demanding justice. The fate of the SS guards in 1945 serves as a permanent warning to history. Power without morality is a house of cards, and when it falls, the vengeance of the oppressed is as certain as the rising sun. The story of the revenge is a dark chapter, but it is a human one. It shows us that while the law may be slow, the human spirit's need for retribution is a force that no wall, no fence, and no uniform can ever fully contain. As we close this investigation into the final hours of the SS, we are left with a haunting question. In a world where such atrocities were possible, is true justice even achievable? Perhaps not. But in the spring of 1945, for those who had lived through the hell of the camps, a single act of retribution was often the only light they had left. The shadow of the Third Reich is long, but it is illuminated by the stories of those who survived to see their tormentors fall.